Thank you, Mike. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm sure you had a real challenge getting here, and it's nice to look out and see so many faces with the weather that we had came in last night. I'd like to thank our sponsors for putting this event on today, and I think it's going to be a great day for all of us. Encourage you to interact with each other, get to know someone that you've never met before, and amazing what you might learn. So it's my privilege to talk to you today about program management in matrix environments. How many people have never heard of the word matrix environment? Yeah, a few people. Good. So I have a few theoretical slides, which are now no longer a waste of time. So we'll get right into it. This is the agenda for my talk this morning, some brief introductory remarks, and then I'm going to talk about the matrix environment. We're going to talk about matrix program or project teams. And then I'm going to tell you about my career experience, and that's really the sort of core of my talk is what have I learned in these 30 years that I've been banging away with project and program management, especially with a focus on matrix environments. I talk a little bit about enterprise project management systems and how they work in those environments. And then last but not least, what I really want you to take away is some lessons learned. Hey, we're project managers, we have to have lessons learned, right? So, and then there'll be time for Q&A, and I encourage you to think about your questions, and we'll get to those near the end. So this is just a little bit about me. Mike's already mentioned it, so we'll just get rid of that guy, and we'll move right into some definitions. So it's important that we define our terms, and this will be no surprise to anyone here. These are the classical definitions for project, for program, and for portfolio. And the thing that I think sometimes we forget is that they all fit together. And when we start talking about the portfolio of a company, we're talking about essentially everything that the company is doing. And that's then subdivided into programs, and those programs are subdivided into projects. They all link together. And because of my background, which is a little bit different, I don't come from IT or from manufacturing or construction project management. I've worked my whole life in a research and development environment, which is different. They don't think the way most project management people do. They don't have a long history of project management. And so it's a very dynamic environment, and it's a challenge to bring project management principle and practice into those types of organizations. And so I hope that my experience will be of value to you. We talk about culture. And we all know that in any organization, there's a continuum of project management culture. On the left-hand side, you have your classical functional organization. Now, a functional organization basically is one that has all the departments with their department managers or directors or VPs, whatever they may be, and they work in their area. It could be sales, could be manufacturing, could be IT, whatever it is. And they work up and down in their functional area, and they don't really have a lot of strong communication with other areas in the business until they have to. As we move all the way over to the far right-hand side, we talk about fully projectized organizations. And these are organizations where there are no real departmental heads. Everything is a project. And in this type of environment, the project manager or program manager is king or queen, and they run everything. They have all the power, all the authority, and everything the company does is looked at from a project perspective. And of course, no surprise, there's everything in between. And this is where the term matrix comes from. A matrix environment is a company that has introduced projects into the company, but still has some degree of functional area management. How do you blend those together is really what matrix environments are all about. And of course, there are degrees to the left and degrees to the right. A functional matrix closer to the left, a project matrix closer to the right. And a lot has been written about a so-called balance matrix, and as you might imagine, a balance matrix is where they're trying to balance those two things, the functional area and the project leadership. So here's a picture of a traditional sort of functional environment. You've got your sales group, your engineering group, finance group, operations. Don't worry about the titles, those are arbitrary. But this is just an illustration really to give you a sense that this is how a company might be structured. And we understand that in a traditional hierarchical structure, work flows up and down in this sort of single functions, whether it's the sales guys or the engineering guys, whatever, they're doing their thing. The challenge of a functional organization is that work tends to flow in silos. It moves up and down in those functional areas, and then when they finally get around to it, they flip it over to the next guy. And this is where you get the classic cartoon that I think we've all seen. What the sales department wanted, what engineering delivered, which is, like they just wanted a swing from a tree bough. How many of you have seen that cartoon, right? And then, you get all these completely, horrible permutations of what actually was required. And it seems so obvious. You think, well, why don't you guys just talk to each other? You would have got the right thing at the end. Well, this is because of the challenges of hierarchical structures in a functional environment. So the work tends to flow in these silos, and we end up with what I call throw it over the wall syndrome. So you have silo one where they're doing whatever they're doing. The engineering guys, they're pretty sure of what's needed. And then the sales guys, they're waiting to get this wonderful product, and then they eventually get it, and it's like, no, this is not what we wanted. And there's this wall between, and so they throw it over the wall, and then they have to sort of start to really communicate, and guess what? They've lost a lot of time. They're no longer competitive. And so these are structures that have had to change because of the competitive environment of the world that we find ourselves in. So what does a matrix environment really look like? Well, in a matrix environment, you still have these functional areas. But what happens is you have a new group that manages projects. And in that group, you might have project managers. You can see here we have project manager 1, project manager 2. There could be many. It just depends on the size of the organization. And what they do is they start selecting people from the functional areas. And those people become the project team. This is all very basic, I know, but it's important to understand why these things are done. Now, in a balanced matrix design, the challenge that immediately emerges is that for any individual who participates in the project team, they suddenly have 2 bosses. No matter where in the continuum the organization is, there's always a degree of double bossness, okay? Even though matrix designs have been around for decades, they're still relatively new, given the fact that companies have largely functioned on a military hierarchical structure for well over a century. So we might say, we sit here today and we go, well, matrix has been around for a long time. Yes, it has. But relative to the amount of time that corporations have been around, it's not that long. So they are still new, and companies are still struggling with how to do this effectively. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So in this illustration, Susie here, she has 2 bosses. She has her manager of sales that she reports to, her line manager, and she also has a project manager that she reports to on her project team. And this is the essence of the challenge of a matrix environment. Okay, so what are some of the advantages of matrix program or project teams? The major advantages of a matrix design is that the project becomes the point of emphasis. It's no longer about my department and what I'm doing in my department. It's all about the project. Suddenly the organization is focused on the project or the program. Cross-functional teams contain every cross-functional area of expertise that's necessary for project success. And I have to say, of all the things that I have been a part of in my career, this is the number one most important aspect of a matrix environment. You bring people together who are accountable to deliver something, and everybody you need is at the table. So you no longer have situations where, well, I didn't know about that. Bill never told me that we were going to do it that way. Well, sorry, you were at the meeting. These project team meetings, everybody's there. All the information's available. So guess what? Everybody has to start to pull together. You get better company-wide use of resources. You can often find that when matrix teams come together, you can actually save quite a bit on resources because you're not having to duplicate or triplicate or quadruplicate everything across all the departments. You just need one set of resources. There's a lot more flexibility in organizing projects within a matrix. You can move things around. You can move resources and people around. And this next point is really, really important, the cross-pollination of information and expertise. So let's say you're the sales guy or gal, and you're on the project team for some new product that's going to be delivered. And so you're representing the sales function, but then there's an engineering person on that same team. Over time, what do you think the salesperson is going to learn about engineering? Something, you think? Absolutely. And the engineering person is going to learn something about sales. And so all of a sudden, you have people on this team cross-pollinating understanding of another area. This is always good. The other thing that can happen is that people get so interested in other areas is that staff gets seconded into other departments to work there for a while. And I've seen this in my lifetime. I worked for a company, which I'll be talking about shortly, where they did this on a regular basis. People would be seconded into other areas, primarily for the purpose of cross-pollination of ideas. Obviously, one of the major advantages of a matrix design is that we break down these silos. There is no longer my information and your information. There's just project information. That's it. When you have geographically dispersed teams, a matrix team is very valuable because you can interact across all kinds of distance, especially with the technology that we have today. You don't have to physically be in the same room all the time. And also there's an access to reservoirs of technology. So instead of, again, replicating the technology across different departments in a company, you can have one set of technology that everybody buys into. And then lastly, one of the advantages of a matrix design is that it actually preserves the functional area aspects of the company. They're not being wiped out. They're not saying, oh, no, we're a fully projectized organization. We don't need departments anymore. No, in a matrix design, you're respecting those functional areas for what they do. You still have to have line management. There are things that are not project related that the company still needs to do. And so in a matrix design, you get the benefit of maintaining those functional areas, albeit with some of those people allocated to project or program teams. It's also a better environment for the implementation of any enterprise-wide project management system, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Okay, so those are the advantages. What about the disadvantages of a matrix team? Of course, it's easy, right? You just sort of snap your fingers and matrix environments just are created and it's all wonderful, right? No, that's not how it works. This shouldn't surprise you, but the number one challenge with matrix environments is human beings. It's people. And the reason is because there's an enhanced tendency for conflict. The balance of authority between the project and the functional area is very delicate. And you have to navigate those waters very carefully. When you start moving resources around in an organization in order to feed a project team, this can lead to a lot of political infighting, not necessarily by people on the teams, but by their bosses. And I've seen plenty of this. The division of authority and responsibility in a matrix environment is complex because people will argue and start to say, well, no, this is my functional area, I should be doing this. And the project manager says, no, but this is a project thing, so I should be doing this. And you can get into some conflict. The other reason is that it violates the management principle of unity of command. We all understand that. You can't have, 5 or 6 people telling someone what to do. And a matrix environment, by definition, you have 2 people telling one person what to do. And that's the challenge. How do you do that? How do you maintain that balance? So people are involved. Therefore, conflict, it's inevitable. You cannot get away from it. And an attempt to get away from it is always bad. It always ends badly. It's much better to embrace this as a reality and say, okay, we know this is going to happen. What are we going to do about it? Right? Okay. So this is just a quick graph. I don't expect you to be able to read the text on there. But basically, this just shows that whenever you form a team, and I think we all know this, if anybody's ever worked on a project team, there's always an increase in conflict at the beginning as the team is forming, right? We've all heard the forming, norming, storming, performing analogy, and that is the reality. That is exactly what happens. In a matrix environment, it's enhanced because now you have to still do your functional thing and you're now on a project team. And so there's a sense of being tugged in two directions. Okay, so at this juncture, I'd like to just kind of move into talking a little bit more about my career experience. And I'm sharing this with you to kind of give you some insights to especially the R&D environment and how maybe you could apply it in your environment as well. And so we'll start off with sort of a summary of my career experience, which something like what's on the screen. It's actually not my career experience, okay? This is, I just love this ad from Dilbert. So how's your project going? It's a steaming pile of failure. It's like 15 drunken monkeys with a jigsaw puzzle. The boss comes in, how's your project going? Fine. Reminds me of the Italian Job movie, right? Fine, freaked out, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. Okay. So for you to understand the R&D environment a little bit more, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how you develop a drug. And by drug, that's a very broad term, but I'm just going to rip through this real fast to give you an insight so that some of the terms I'm going to use later you'll understand. So company X wants to develop a new drug, and typically this starts with an analysis of the disease state that you're targeting. So you want to find a solution for a problem. And so the company would then do a lot of investigation to say, all right, what is this disease that we want to target? It could be heart failure, it could be, blood pressure issues, it could be cancer, it could be any area where disease exists. And so the idea is that the company wants to find a solution to a particular disease state. We call it the therapeutic indication. And so they'll do a lot of initial work that is really basically theoretical to try and establish what they're going to do. And then move into the discovery phase. And in the discovery phase, they're actually starting to work on what kind of molecule might be able to help in this particular disease state. And a lot of this discovery work today is actually done in what we call in silico, which means it's a theoretical computer-generated analysis of the biological aspects of the disease to try and figure out from a computerized perspective what kind of molecule might work in this particular disease state. Maybe targeting a particular cell, the surface of the cell. We can model that on computers today. It then moves into in vitro studies. In vitro literally means in glass, which means they're starting to do wet chemistry, wet biochemistry, trying to figure out what they can develop, what kind of molecules. They start screening literally thousands, tens of thousands of molecules to try and find one that might show promise. That moves into preclinical studies, which are where they do those initial tests. They've selected a molecule, or maybe 3 or 4, and they start some trials in very, very simplistic animal models, rats, mice, that kind of thing. During the course of all this, you have to be able to test everything that you're developing, and so they have to develop the methods. This is what we call analytical method development. How do you actually test what you're developing and make sure that it's always the same, it's characterized a certain way? Manufacturing, how are you going to make this product? How are you going to make it at a scale that you're going to be able to meet the need that the guys way back at the beginning, when they did the disease analysis, how do you know you're going to have enough scale that you can meet that need? How are you going to make it at that scale? Maybe you have to build an entirely new plant in order to manufacture just this one product. you start to talk about that. Device development. So it's one thing to have a drug, it's another thing, how do you get the drug into the person? Now, if it's a pill or a capsule, that's pretty easy. But a lot of drugs today are actually delivered through very sophisticated devices. How many of you have ever used one of those inhalers, right? So you push a little thing, you rotate a little thing, you breathe in, that's a device. There are many, many devices out there on the market, and each of those have to be developed. You then move into clinical studies, phases 1 through 3. In phase 1, you're basically establishing whether the product actually gets into the bloodstream, how it works in the bloodstream. In phase 2, you start to figure out what's the correct dose, and in phase 3, you actually target the actual disease state in patients with that particular disease, hopefully proving that the drug works or not. There's always a staged process in this to make sure that people are protected and not put in any undue risk. During the course of all this, there are regulatory submissions. You have to compile an amazing amount of paper. Well, it used to be paper, now it's all e-submissions. But in the old days, when we did submissions for new drugs, I worked for Glaxo for many years. Literally, for a new drug, it would fill this entire stage to the ceiling with paper. So there's a lot of data that goes into just one drug submission. And then once that product hits the market, gets onto the market, you have post-approval lifecycle management. So you're looking at tweaking this, tweaking that, maybe adding a slightly different aspect to the indication, etc. So you want to keep that drug going and tweaking it. All right, so that's just a quick overview because I'm going to use some of these terms as we move along. So one of the companies I selected to tell you a little bit about was Adcock Ingram Pharmaceuticals. This is a pretty large company based in South Africa. I was living there for 14 years, and I worked for this company as a drug development leader. So I was basically in charge of research and development. It's a pretty big company, about $1 billion US, and they had two aspects to the company's workings. One was they imported a lot of finished drugs from the large US and European multinational companies. So those would just come in, and there was basically a regulatory aspect to getting them approved in South Africa, and then they would go on to the market. But they also had their own development and manufacturing capability as well. And so I headed up all of that, and I had a number of people obviously reporting into me. This is a very simplistic diagram of the structure, but in terms of our own development, this is kind of what it looked like. We had a manager who did the formulation development, the guy that put all the pieces together to make the drug. Then we had another person that headed up the analytical development. That's the person that developed the methods that were used to test the drugs. And then lastly, there was someone that was responsible for all the regulatory submissions. And when I arrived there, those three groups were operating, guess what, in a complete silo. They were literally, the guy in formulations was making stuff that they couldn't test. And nobody in regulatory even knew they were working on it until all of a sudden they were presented with this pile of paper and said, there you go. And they're going like, what is this? So it was my first opportunity really to reorganize the entire development area into a matrix environment where each functional area manager was now going to lead a cross-functional team. So I had a number of aspects to this that proved to be effective. The first was telling all three of those managers that they were going to be leading a cross-functional team that was comprised of people that didn't work for them. Yes, they looked at me kind of strangely initially, because they'd never heard of this before. It was brand new concept. So how we did this was we said, all right, well, let's say the manager of the functional or of the formulation development area, he's really good at formulation development, right? So he doesn't need a really strong formulator person to be on his team. So let's choose the weakest formulation person and put that person on his team, because each team has to be represented by all the functions, right? That's what a matrix is. And so that's what we did. We took the strongest individuals and gave them to the teams where they were going to be able to provide the greatest input. So these groups formed up, and the choice of who went on what team really came down to a more detailed discussion of the individual strengths, the weaknesses, the personalities even of those individuals. And this is where you really have to understand human beings. You cannot just do this in a theoretical way. You have to understand you're working with people and you're expecting them to change their behaviors. And this is really the challenge of a matrix environment. Okay, so this resulted in a simple small group, essentially, that was basically successful in a complete reorg of this area of the company. There was a shift from functional area focus to projects. They no longer talked about what they were doing in their area. It was all about the projects, what was happening with the projects. And the key thing that we observed was this cross-pollination concept. I'd be walking down the hall and I'd run into one of the individuals who was on a project team who happened to be a formulation expert. And I said, do you know where, I don't know, I can't remember the names, but let's just say Susie. Do you know where Susie is? Because I have a regulatory question. And this person said to me, well, what's the question? And I said, well, it's this, 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 and this. And he goes, well, I know that. I can tell you that. And I went, wow, this is really working. They actually know something about something outside of their area of expertise. And so I grabbed a hold of that and I said to myself, this is a way that we can evaluate how teams are developing. The degree of cross-pollination that's happening is a reflection of how effective that team is. And so at some point later in my career, I actually mandated that. I said, I want to be able to do this. I want to be able to walk down the corridor and ask anybody in the project team a question at this level of detail, and every person should know the answer. So it was interesting. So silos were broken down. No longer was this sort of, work up and down in your area, throw it over the wall, and hope that the next guys liked what you'd done. That didn't happen anymore. All of a sudden, they had to talk to each other. The analytical person had to say, look, if you do it this way, I'm not going to be able to test it because there's no way to do that. Oh, okay, well, I guess we better change how we do it then. Yeah. And the regulatory person is there and they're guiding this whole thing and they're saying, you got to make sure that you do this, 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 and this because I have to submit this one day. And so that played right back to the beginning. So you save a lot of time in a matrix environment. You're not waiting for mistakes to be made and then have to go back and reiterate the whole thing. Because drug discovery and development takes a very long time. Anybody have an idea of how long it takes? Yeah, about 20 years. That's right. It takes about 20 years. Okay, so all team members felt empowered. That was the other thing that came out of this experience. They were excited about their projects. All of a sudden, they weren't just grinding away in their area. They suddenly realized, hey, there's a big world out there. I'm part of doing something that's brand new. And people actually started to fight to get onto project teams. I want to be on the project team. And it was kind of a new problem that we had to deal with, but it was a good problem, right? Okay. So the other thing that came out of this is that if you were kind of watching this slide, you'll notice that these three people, because they reported to me, they're now a team as well. So there was no ability to hide because they all reported to me. I had my team and they had their teams. And so there was a direct connection to what was actually happening on the ground. And so we had to work together as a team as well. And that was an interesting experience and a big part of the success, I think, because these people recognized that and they wanted to work together. Okay, so the next company I want to share with you about is a large Canadian private generic pharmaceutical company who I chose not to name for reasons that I'd rather not go into, but it's to protect the innocent. So very briefly, what's the difference between a generic company and a brand company? So a brand company, we all understand, those are the Mercks and the Glaxos and the Russells and the Pfizers of the world, right? And they're the companies that really do the innovative discovery and development of brand new drugs never before seen on the market, right? A generic company is a company that comes later and basically has access to a lot of that information, especially the clinical information, but not necessarily any of the analytical information. So they have to redevelop the drug, make sure that it works, but they don't have to prove that it'll work in the disease state. And so this saves a lot of time and cost, and therefore, no surprise, generic companies can provide drugs at a far reduced price. And because they have to meet certain regulatory requirements, they are safe, efficacious, and of high quality. Okay, so that's basically the big difference. So this is a large generic company that I worked for a very long time, 20 years. They had over 300 products in development, 300 products. I had 2 lives there in my 20 years as a director. The first was in global project management, and the second was the director of Biopharmaceutical program management. And I'll explain a little bit about those as we go along. Global project management involved moving from a strong functional organizational structure to a balanced matrix. Now keep in mind that I came into this company having had a very positive experience in my past, albeit in another country, but nevertheless a positive experience in terms of moving an organization from a functional to balanced matrix design. The key difference was the size and the scale of the companies. Even though it was a large company in South Africa, it was a small group that I was working with. This was a totally different kettle of fish. There were 1,200 employees in development in this company. There was a deeply entrenched culture of we need to do everything. So when it came to the portfolio piece, and this is where I was referring to earlier, how they're all interconnected. The portfolio piece was all about what are we doing? How many projects should we be working on? Which are the high value projects that we should be working on? And can we, in the name of limited resources, can we just get rid of some of these low value ones? Well, no was the answer. We have to do everything. Okay. The company did suffer from a degree of founder's trap. I'm sure you're familiar with the term, but basically that's where the founder's unfortunately been around for too long and is too integrated into the company and won't get out of the way, and so it creates some problems. That individual had direct access to 1,200 research and development employees and had no problem walking right down into the lab and telling somebody on the bench what to do. So, nevertheless, undaunted by this, myself and another individual completely reorganized every single person in R&D into global program teams. We called them program teams because each of these teams was responsible for 50 or more active projects within their particular purview. Now, global project management was able to provide good visibility of the portfolio. For the first time, the executives had visibility of everything that was being done, because before that, they didn't. So that was a really good early low-hanging fruit that we got out of this. The second was, what are the value drivers? What was really driving the projects that were going to produce hopefully something at the end of the day versus those that would not? So from a portfolio analysis perspective, this was a really good development. Unfortunately, the founder bypassed the leadership of global project management on a regular basis. That proved to be one of the challenges. Okay, for example, we were unable to kill any low-value projects, not one. We couldn't get rid of them. Whenever we raised resource constraints and said, listen, if you keep adding projects, we're going to have to get more people. We need to kill some of these projects and just work with the resources we have, because we can't just go out and get these people. They're expensive, they're all, you need PhDs, you need people with advanced degrees to do this kind of work, as you can imagine. And unfortunately, none of those arguments around constraints with respect to resources ever worked. And so the answer was always, well, just hire what you need. Just hire. And of course, this ended badly with some massive layoffs down the road. Now, here's the key point. We couldn't control the portfolio, and therefore, we couldn't control the programs or the projects. That's not a surprise. There were multiple entry points into what we called the R&D hopper. So you've got this, all these projects coming in from a variety of places. You want them to go through a streamlined process, right? But they would come in from all kinds of places without us even knowing sometimes that they'd come in. Some projects really benefited from project management principle and practice, especially those where there was a lot of visibility by the executives. All of a sudden it was like, oh yes, we got to let the project guys do this because we really, really want this out the other side. Meanwhile, we're saying, look, just let us do this for everything. Everything will come out better. Well, no, it didn't quite work that way. There was a huge gap between project management theory and the practice thereof. And this was the challenge. So that did not end so well. And the individual who worked with me to build this, or I worked with them, I should say, he went on to other things, and I went on to other things because, frankly, both of us were burnt out after about 8 years of doing this. And there was a new light on the horizon, and that was when the company decided that they would go into the area of biopharmaceuticals. Now, biopharmaceutical is basically a protein-based drug. It's a biologically based drug, not a chemically based drug. And so this is a whole brand new area, very exciting, still is. And I was given the responsibility to build the entire program management function for this area. And so it was a clean slate, and I thought, wow, this is fantastic. It was a smaller group. It was a locally based management team with a virtual environment with over 100 vendors doing the research and development all over the world. So it was a really dynamic new environment. And of course, there was no involvement from the founder or the owner in this new area. None, zero. It was fantastic. We were walking around going, yes, this is amazing. So I remember saying to myself, this time I'll be able to build it unhindered. And didn't quite work out that way. There was a lot of executive support for a balanced matrix structure, and right out of the gate, that's what we did, because we'd done it many times, and it works if you let it work. Unfortunately, ran right into one functional area that refused to buy into the concept, and another one that, despite repeated attempts, many meetings in their office, just wanted to work in a silo. And with respect to those people that stay in their silos, I understand why in an R&D environment. Part of the reason is because in research and development, you don't know what you're going to get, and you don't know how long it's going to take. So when the project management person comes along and says, hey, I got to update my Gantt chart, they go, well, whatever. I'm not telling you how long it's going to take because I don't know. Okay, well, that's fine. Can you guess? Can we put something in the Gantt that's going to take maybe 3 months to do this or whatever it is? These are long timelines, right? These are not days and weeks. These are months and years. But we need to put something in because everybody else is depending on some kind of date to know when they should start to do things. All right, we'll put that. And so the other thing that happens is you have to do a lot of iterations. You try something, it doesn't work. You have to do it again. You have to do it again. And it's not like Agile, where you have these short bursts of activity and then you get something that you can deliver. You might not get anything. You might not have anything come out the other side, and you have to go all the way back and start over. That's the challenge of an R&D environment and what makes project management and program management particularly difficult. Okay, so let's move on. How are we doing for time? Pretty good. All right, so this is a whole new company. It's called Rock Therapeutics. And this is not a drug company per se. This is a cell therapy company. It's a stem cell research-based company about 2 blocks north of here in the Mars Discovery area, where I work for this company now and have been for some time as a consultant in program and project management. And what they're doing is using stem cells to deliver cell therapy to patients in a variety of different areas, in neurology, immunology, and in cardiology. And it's a very exciting area. It's brand new. It's literally cutting edge science that they're doing. And so I want to share with you how I approached this company after they approached me. How was I going to do this? Now keep in mind my experience with the companies that I'd worked for. Keep in mind some of the bruises that I have at this point in my career, which is in the autumn of my career. What am I going to do now? I've got this new opportunity. Really, this is a true clean slate, because this company, literally when I joined them, there were like 13 people. And it's hundreds now. So I went into it looking at it strategically, and I basically said, all right, in order to have project management maturity, you have to have people, processes, and technology lined up. Those are the three things. And when you have those three things in the correct balance, you're going to be moving that organization toward more and more mature project and program management understanding. And I focused on the W5s: who, what, when, where, and why. Who's doing what are they doing, when are they doing it, why are they doing it, and how are they doing it? And if you ask those questions, you'll learn a lot about a research and development environment. How are these people interacting, and what are they doing is very important to know. The company is divided into, the head office is in the US, in Cambridge, and then there's two other sites where they operate. One is in New York City, and the other is here in Toronto, as I said, at the Mars Discovery building. And so we came up with this kind of a matrix project management organization. Toronto focuses on the cardiac research and development aspects. Cambridge focuses on immunology, and New York is focusing on neurology, central nervous system disorders. And what we did is we established a technical lead at each of these sites and a program management person to co-lead teams that would come together in each of these three areas. In support of that, you've got the functions underneath. You've got finance, you've got IT, of course. These are broad, across the company functions that you have to have and everybody relied on. And we also formed a group called the Project Management Support Group. And the reason it's called the Project Management Support Group is because they did not like the term Project Management Office. Because a PMO is associated with big and bureaucratic, and we don't want that. Right? So you can understand the culture of this organization is extremely dynamic and very much leading edge, as I said. So when I started using the term PMO, I was kind of taken into a back room, thrashed 100 times and said, don't you ever use that term again. And I said, okay, no problem. Let's call it this. And that's fine. We like that term. So there was also obviously relationships with human resources, with contracts people, etc. And so here's some of the sort of highlights of how this was set up and how it's functioning. The projects and the program were managed at the research sites. Both the project manager and the technical lead co-led the team. There was a dotted line report from the project teams at the sites into this centralized project management support group, and program authority and responsibility was matrixed with the technical lead. This support group provided project management expertise to a given site until the site warranted their own program manager. So some of these programs are at different levels of maturity, and you don't have to have a full-blown program manager for it. You just need like a project coordinator, and that's enough. And so this group could provide that as a support function. They also can provide, or do provide, the sort of program level information and reporting for the whole organization. And so the way I kind of pitched this to the organization was I said, look, think about it this way. You have a site, you have these program teams at the site, each of which have project managers and their sub-teams feeding into the program teams. And if necessary, the program manager can actually help to support one of these project teams by going back, sitting with them in their meetings, and making sure that they're doing it the way it's going to help when it finally gets to the program level. So there was a lot of back and forth like this in the early days. And the other thing that I pushed really hard was it was important for this function, which I had pitched as being portfolio program and project responsibility, that it be at an appropriate level in the organization, not some way down here sort of thing. And because it was being built from scratch, we were able to get this function at an executive level in the organization. And the reason is because it drives the culture of the organization. The matrix work relationship concepts, it's important that that be understood at an executive level. The cross-functional project team constructs, standards and practices were done in consultation with the chief executive suites and other executive leadership. So it's strategic, this role. The project management support group is a tactical group that is operational and supports the technical leads in the programs. So in the first 3 months, basically we established a program and project management function in the organization where there was nothing before. The organizational structure, the key roles were confirmed and recruitment was started. We communicated and communicated and communicated the purpose and responsibilities of the project management function. Again, think about the environment. These are a bunch of really, really smart people. Like 95% are PhDs running around doing leading edge science. They don't know a lot about project management. So you have a great opportunity to introduce the concepts to them. And guess what? They loved it because they realized that they could focus on the science and somebody else is focusing on making sure that they're doing the right thing at the right time. And so most people embrace that with both hands. We established a project management culture based on a matrix approach right out of the gate. And we entrenched that matrix leadership at every level of the company that we could. And then out of that, normative working relationships started to happen within that environment. The second phase, which is sort of the next 3 to 9 months, we started initial project management processes, tools and techniques. We rolled out these things. And we used a classical magnifying glass approach to project management. Let's worry about the stuff that's near term with a greater degree of detail and not worry about the stuff that's going to happen 3 to 5 years from now because we don't need to know all that. We established a cadence of critical processes that drive the projects. Standards were established for basic tools and techniques. People didn't have basic stuff like, well, how do you take minutes? Is everybody using the same template for doing minutes? No, there was like 5 of them. Okay, well, let's standardize that. Do you think that would be good? Okay, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Some training, review of some optimal project management software. Everybody wanted to talk about software at this point, and I just kept saying no, it's too early for software. You have to establish the culture first. You have to understand what project management is before you start thinking it's a computer system. Because the day you think that project management is a computer system, you're dead. And so that was good. We were able to do that. So we all know the 10 knowledge areas, of course, and so what were we going to do? Well, we focused on really just 4 that we thought were most important. I don't know why those circles aren't where they're supposed to be, but anyway. So we focused on scope, cost, communication, and time management. Those are the big 3 plus communications. That should come as no surprise to anyone in this room. But the key here is that you don't have to do everything. You look at the organization and you tailor the project management that the company needs that is going to benefit the most from right away. And that's what you focus on. And you bring the other things in later. You take a phased approach. And that's has been very effective with this organization. Later on, bring in things like costs. You start to look at how are we going to mature this organization. Using something like OPM3 as a guide or whatever, you start to say, all right, we ought to monitor and measure how the organization is going. Okay, this project management support group was responsible for building the organization-wide procedures and policies to make sure there was harmonization across, and especially when you have non-co-located teams, non-co-located research areas at different cities, you can imagine that this would be important. We had centralized project and program budget and schedule reporting. This group was responsible to drive the culture of the organization. So they'd be doing the rah-rah sessions and talking about project management, doing road shows and things like that. The other thing we looked at was this so-called R&D hopper. You can imagine a company like this is always looking at new opportunities. And so again, because of my experience with having not had the control over the R&D hopper, we made sure that we built a process and system that would allow for one process for projects to come into the organization, be evaluated and decided upon. And that was also very effective. I want to speed up just a little bit, just in the interest of time. So, enterprise project management systems. So I have quite a bit of experience with Microsoft Project Professional Online in its different iterations over the decades. And I think, as Mike mentioned, I've been the business lead for implementing 2 of these across 2 organizations. And it's a very big project, as you can imagine, those of you that have worked on this. When you're talking about 1,200 employees, this is a huge change for them. And you really need to look at this as a major, major project for the organization. But some of the things that we learned were invaluable. The first thing is that the actual implementation, not the once it's up and running, but the process of implementing a project management enterprise system actually will help you to break down the silos that exist in that organization. Well, why is that? Well, because guess what? You have to get all the functions together, and they have to work together on this new project. And you have to decide how you're going to manage your projects in the system. And that requires that people talk to each other who would not normally talk to each other. It reinforces the project information concept. It's not my information and your information, it's just project information. What do we need to know? Who needs to know it? When do they need to know it? This can be tailored to the organization as well. There's no reason why you have to do everything just because, Microsoft or someone else says that this is their whole bailiwick. You can decide in many cases what modules you want to implement. I was also part of and have the t-shirt for an SAP implementation that the company decided to do as well across the entire organization, not just R&D, the entire organization, of at that time. And believe me, that was a lot of fun. Fun. So you can tailor this. So you're tailoring your culture, you're tailoring the tools, you're tailoring the techniques that you're using. Everything requires that you analyze the company and give them what's going to give them the biggest bang for their buck, and not go in with this sort of vanilla approach that says you have to do this because that's what it says, in some book somewhere. The other thing that these systems do, these enterprise systems do, is they integrate portfolio, program, and project. And that is a really strong benefit. However, as I've said here, it's not for the faint of heart. One of the things that we did in one implementation was we deliberately appointed people who had reservations about matrix teams. We deliberately put them onto the implementation team so that they would get a sense of the flavor and the value of this, and it really helped to sell the overall idea. Okay, let's talk about some lessons learned that came out of all this stuff that this one guy named Don Wallar has done, and I certainly don't purport to be an authority on any of this stuff. This has just been, my experience, what I've learned. I had a lot of people that I learned from over the years, and some of the things that I'm sharing with you today is really just because of my experience. I didn't even have a clue that it was going to go the way it went when I got into some of these things, but hopefully it's been of some value to you. So obviously matrix organizations, they present unique advantages and challenges. There's no question about it. It's not an easy thing to do depending on the organization and its culture and its history and its size. Those factors are the most important that are going to help determine how this is going to go and the approach that you want to take. The project management spectrum position, where you fall on, where the organization falls on that spectrum, whether it's a strong functional area managed company or whether they've already starting to move toward a project-based company, is going to depend on what that culture is, and your approach will need to start with an analysis and an understanding of what that culture is. People and their behaviors is the number one factor for success. Surprise! It's not about technology. It's not about paper. It's not about tools and techniques. It's not about principle and practice. It's about people and their behaviors that will determine success in moving an organization more toward a matrix design. The larger and the older the company, the harder it's going to be to change. Oh, yeah, that's true of us too, right? I don't know about the larger part, but the older we get, the harder it is to change. So with organizations, it's no surprise that that's the case. You have deeply embedded history. Somebody once said, you want to know about the history of a company, read its bylaws. Because bylaws are written for everything that's happened to that company. Oh, we need a bylaw for this and a bylaw for that. And you just read it and you know exactly what happened in that company, right? Executive buy-in. Now, I want to dwell on this point for just a little bit. You have to have executive buy-in. You have to have a champion in the organization that understands and embraces project management and what you're trying to do. Otherwise, you're dead before you start. Project management is a term that most executives who've not been part of the world that we live in, they think it sounds good, but they actually don't know what it is. And as soon as you start to introduce change, they suddenly aren't so sure they like it anymore. And when you really start to introduce change and start talking about having people reporting in teams and functional areas not necessarily having complete control over the resources of the company, then they really get nervous. And all of a sudden, the executive buy-in you thought you had, you don't have so much after all. So how do you know that? Well, communicate, communicate, communicate. Make sure that they understand and that you're continually reinforcing what you're doing. You need that executive support, or it's going to roll over into the corner and suffer an untimely death. There's always a drift toward functional authority unless there's executive support. I've seen this 1,000 times. You have a project team meeting, the project manager says, okay, this is what we're going to do. One person on that project team isn't happy with it. What do? They run back to their functional area boss and they say, so-and-so is doing this on the project team and I'm not really happy about this, right? The functional area boss then runs to their executive and says, oh, did you know that this is what's happening on the project team? That executive then goes over to the manager of the projects and says, oh, you can't do this. What just happened? You just got shot in the knees. That's what just happened, okay? You don't have control of your project anymore because that executive cut you off. And so this is the reality of what happens when things don't go the way people want. This is why people are so important and why those behaviors are so important. You have to have a conversation with those executives at that point and say, you can't do this. And if you do this, you're undermining the entire culture that you say you want to have. And so those conversations are not easy. You have to have steel in your backbone. But if you believe in what you're doing and you believe it's valuable for the company and you can demonstrate that value, they will go with you. All right. We did roadshows in the companies. We would put together a small team and we went around and we explained what project management was, what's program management. These are people, remember, that didn't, they have never heard of project management per se, or maybe they've heard of it, they have a vague understanding. But we did these roadshows to basically do some really core sort of theoretical training and so forth. And that was it. It worked. Beware of saboteurs. Machiavelli said, keep your friends close, your enemies closer. Find out who could really sabotage what you're trying to do and get to know them. Sell them the idea. I did this a lot. I worked with those people that I was sure were really not on board. Okay, have an implementation plan that's tailored to the organization. In South Africa, they use the term slowly catch the monkey. Don't be in too big a hurry. Use a phased approach. Grab some low-hanging fruit. Produce measurable, positive results as soon as you can, and make sure the executives know about it. We value what we measure. So engage HR with the organizational change. Don't leave them out. Consider measuring and rewarding matrix team behaviors and team results. There's ways to do this, and it reinforces that you really believe what you're doing. The soft stuff is the hard stuff. Project team skills need to be part of recruitment checklists. We don't do enough of this, I don't think, even today. We say we want project teams, but we don't recruit as if we had it. Okay, so we're going to move to Q&A. Happy to take questions at this time. Right?
So if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll bring the mic to you so everybody can hear the question, okay?
Thanks, Tom. Very interesting. Really doing the real life examples of how this works or doesn't work in companies. In your first company in South Africa, when you made changes, you talked about taking the more advanced technical people and moving them to the other departments. Did you have any challenges converting a functional manager to a cross-functional program?
Yeah, there were some challenges, and to be honest, they weren't around the project management aspects. They were around the details of the science involved. It's one thing to say we're going to put a strong person here technically with a weaker person here. It's easy to say that, but the reality is that the science will dictate your success, and the person's ability to actually do that work is very important in a research and development environment. So you do have to be very careful. I didn't have time to go into it, but one of the ways that we mitigated that was by having a mentorship situation where you had a strong person with a weaker person on the same team. And then that person would then be seconded out to another team once that person was brought up to speed. Yeah, so great question.
Another question?
One of your examples, you said people decided to stay inside of
Yes.
So two questions. What was your reaction? And the fact that they decided to go inside of how that impacted the entire matrix of the organization?
Right. So the question is, how when people decide they're going to stay in silos, how did that affect the matrix organization? Well, it affects it because at the end of the day, if a person is determined to stay in a silo, which essentially reveals itself as a lack of communication, that's basically what happens. They just stop communicating. And so the project team, you then have to find ways to get that information to the project team despite their unwillingness to share it. And so you literally have to have, special operations people that go in, with infrared stuff and find out what's going on. And that's exactly what we did. We would take the person aside who was from that same functional area and say to them, look, we need this information. They agreed. And so we left it to them to literally sit down with that particular individual and make sure they got that information regardless. If somebody wants to stop, then that you can't change that. Obviously, I had chats with the higher ups to say so-and-so's not playing the game. What can we do? But for reasons I won't go into, it was impossible to change this particular person. So we just had to live with it. So you get creative.